I've got a few slides to share some of the stuff that we've been doing on the soil health side or on the fertility side through AIM. So the stuff I'm going to talk about, I'm going to share with you a little bit on our legume nitrogen project, reduced phosphorus, rotational grazing, long-term cover cropping, regen ag project through the hort cluster, and some additional crop rotation projects. So I've talked about this before. This isn't new to any of you, but nitrogen is possibly, and I would say probably, the most complex nutrient that we deal with in potato production and in most crop production, because it comes in many forms. It's uptaken in crops in multiple forms. We get it, so we have to account for, what the nitrogen is coming from fertilizer, and it comes in many forms in the fertilizer, but also what's coming from manure and compost, what's coming from legumes, from fixed fertile legumes the year before, what's coming from the mineralization of the organic matter. There's lots of sources and lots of math to do to kind of figure out how to best manage our nitrogen. In some crops like corn and wheat and a few others, like if we over apply nitrogen, it agronomically usually doesn't affect us as much as it does in potatoes. So if I put too much nitrogen on my corn, it's just money I wasted. It's nitrogen I didn't need, but it doesn't usually set back the crop very much. In potatoes, we put on too much nitrogen. It is, we've been documented for a lot of years that it generally delays tuberization, extends the vegetative window of the crop, keeps the green too long, delays it setting tubers, usually reduces the number of tubers per plant, and then delays that maturity, delays skin set, and lowers specific gravity. And so, if we put on way too much nitrogen for the crop's needs, it's going to have those effects. It's particularly a problem for the indeterminate varieties. So your russet Burbanks and Clearwater russet, some of the indeterminate varieties, you'll see even more effect, but it does affect the determinate varieties as well. But then on the other side, if we don't have enough nitrogen, then we can, we're dealing with reduced yield, we're dealing with plants that perhaps have reduced vigor and health. So we really just have to try and find that intermediate optimum, right? Like we don't want to be too low and we don't want to be too high. And in our system, managing nitrogen in season is difficult because, if we're not fertigating, we don't constantly have opportunities to get nitrogen on the field all the time. We can put a bit of nitrogen in through our sprayers and stuff, but we're only putting on a few pounds at a time, that sort of thing. So it's more difficult in our system than in some systems to spoon feed the crop with nitrogen. So when we're building a nitrogen rate, we need to know, of course, how much does the crop need according to our yield goal. So what's my yield goal, and back out how much nitrogen the crop needs. And then, where's that nitrogen coming from? What's coming from your fertilizer? What's coming from your organic matter? If I have a 2% organic matter field and a 3% organic matter field, I'm going to get a different amount of background nitrogen that's going to mineralize from the 3% organic matter field, right? How much nitrogen is going to be available from that previous legume crop? How much coming from manure and compost? What's the timing of nitrogen availability? So when's it going to release and be available to the crop? These are all important considerations. The one I want to talk about particularly today is how much nitrogen is available from the previous legume crop. These are some of the sort of textbook or recommendations that come from a few different sources in Eastern Canada. The PEI Soil Lab, this is what they marked down as a credit for legumes the year before potatoes. And you can see they have good stand and fair stand, but I don't have a good definition as to what good and fair mean. And you can see those numbers, there's no gradation, there's just 70 and 36 and 36 and 18. And so it's pretty, there's no curve there. And so that's a little bit difficult for some folks. OMAFRA's is even less, gradated. It's just basically, did you have a lot of legume in the stand? 100 pounds. Did you have not, 1/3 or less? Half of that. So it's not a real, it's hard to hang your hat on that and say, oh, I really believe that. Now, Perennia in Nova Scotia just did a fact sheet in the last couple of years. It's probably the most advanced of any that I've seen for Eastern Canada, and it factors in what the species is, what the rate was, how much biomass you had, and it kind of gives you more of a curve, and that kind of you know, theirs gives you anywhere from a 20 to 100 pound an acre credit, kind of depending on, you know, was it alfalfa versus clover, was it fall terminated versus spring terminated? Those are all important things. What's important for us to understand in potato production is if we're talking about credits, the credits depend a lot on when the crop was terminated, when the legume was terminated. If the legume was terminated in the fall or late summer, it starts to clock on mineralization faster. So that the majority of the nitrogen from that crop will not be available till the next year. And if you see that top black line, which is fall terminated red clover, it's only 40–50% available in the spring for your spring wheat or spring barley or that sort of thing when the crop needs it. But then when it needs it in corn and potatoes, is the uptake of nitrogen in potatoes and corn is relatively similar. It's about the same amount of time. It gets up towards 90 to 100% available later on, right? So it mineralizes in July, doesn't mineralize in May and June. If I terminate it in the spring, like if I just plowed it in the spring or just round up and worked it in the spring, most of it's not available until actually probably more like September and October, which is past when the crop needs it. And that's the reason why, in a lot of our cases, we end up, especially with clover, if we have late fall plowed clover or spring plowed clover, that nitrogen is available when the crop doesn't need it. It's then free nitrogen in the soil, and that's nitrogen that can either go up into the atmosphere or down into the water. And it's not, you know, you were fixing nitrogen, but it was nitrogen you weren't able to use on the majority of your crop. Now you can sequester some of that with a cover crop, but your potato crop won't be able to use most of it. It'll only be able to use 30–40% of it. So the timing makes a big difference. Also, that third line down there, the black dotted line that's in the middle, that's oilseed radish as a cover the year before. So that was winter terminated oilseed radish. Oilseed radish doesn't fix nitrogen, but it scavenges nitrogen, carries it over to the next year. And you can see by the summer, it still is making some nitrogen available to the crop from that cover crop that just winter terminated the year before, even though it itself isn't a nitrogen fixer. So, lots of questions from growers and lots of questions on my own part about how much nitrogen do we get from a previous legume crop and how do we improve our recommendations to producers in terms of how to factor this into our nutrient management plans. And so in part of this ACS Living Labs project, I'm working with the Living Labs group, with Ag Canada, and I'm working with Kyra and the department, and we're working on this project, and we were looking at different legume species that had potatoes, primarily alfalfa and red clover. We're looking at the timing of termination, with or without a cover crop, and then different nitrogen rates to help us make some of these, you know, dig into this a little bit more, and hopefully understand better what our credit should be. We had 4 fields of potatoes this year. 1 was in West Prince, 3 were in East Prince. We had Mountain Gem, Rangers, Dakotas, and Payettes. And the reason I picked those, they're all varieties, they're all processing varieties that all have a fairly similar nitrogen recommendation. They all have, the recommended nitrogen rate for them is all somewhere around about 160 pounds an acre. So that, I wanted to have ones that we could compare across fields so they all have fairly similar recommendations. So what we did is these 4 fields were all in an alfalfa grass mix in 2023 that was terminated in the late summer, early fall. It was then tilled and with vertical tillage and then had a cover crop established. 2 of the fields were radish or radish barley and 2 were just barley, spring barley, all of them winter killed. In each field there was a strip perpendicular to the direction of the rows that was left with no cover crop. So it's easier to show you to you graphically. This is one of the fields. So you can see the box in blue. That was where there was no cover crop. The rest of the field had cover crop. So that then when we did the nitrogen rates, they would go across both. And that way we only had to do 1 strip for each nitrogen rate as opposed to having a cover crop section and no cover crop section and then duplicate the rates in each. So tried to make it a little more operationally easy for the farmer, operationally easy for me and Kyra. We did baseline samples in all the field before the covers went in, and then we did follow-up samples again this spring before potato planting. And then each field had 4 fertilizer treatments. So Most of the field was at the grower standard practice, which in most of the fields was around 160 pounds of nitrogen. And then we had a 75% rate and a 50% rate. And then you can see there's a little box that says 0N. So in that little box, which is about 12 rows by 100 feet, we just told the planter operator to turn the fertilizer off, and we just planted seed. And then before the planter went through it, we had it marked off, and then me and Bethany and a bunch of other people went in and hand applied P and K and micros and all the other fertilizers, so that there wouldn't be, it's only 0N, it's not zero fertilizer. So to do this, on 3 of the fields, we split, the nitrogen was split 50-50 between the planter and like either a pre-plant or a at-hilling nitrogen. So 3 of the fields it was pre-plant, 1 of the fields it was at-hilling, but it was basically the blend, the planter blend had 80 N in it, and the whole field got that planter blend, so that we didn't have to change planter blends there. They make it, again, try and keep it easy. The 75% N, we just cut the pre-plant in half, and then in the 50% N, there was no pre-plant. So basically, the 50% was the width of a spreader width of, going down the field type thing, 60 feet or so, and then the same for the 75%. The 3 firms did the pre-plant. The pre-plant was Super U, that was then immediately incorporated during the planting, and then the 1 farm, which is this farm, the N was applied 3 weeks later as a top dress urea and then hilled in. So we did plant and tuber samples as well in late August, early September. When the plants were at basically what we call peak biomass, we took a certain number of plants in each treatment to take back to the lab to analyze how much nitrogen was in them, to understand how much, how easy did those plants uptake nitrogen, was there differences between the plots, and particularly we can use this to try and understand from that 0N plot how much nitrogen the plant was able to get from the soil despite the fact we didn't fertilize it with any nitrogen. So we can use that as that plus the yield estimation we can use to kind of, again, how much potential nitrogen is coming from the legumes, Then, of course, we did harvest samples and soil nitrates at harvest time. They're all harvested within about a week and a half of each other. I don't have the nitrate or the lab nitrogen data yet. I'm mostly going to talk about yield data here at the moment. All of our sites were impacted by dry weather. The one up west was particularly dry. It was basically didn't rain in the field for August and September, so our yields field looked great until the second week of August, and then did not look great afterwards. And so our yields are generally below budget on most of these fields, but still enough to be able to show some interesting data. So these are Dakota russets. This is the field that was way up west. There was no statistical difference in yield or quality between the 100% 75 and 50% nitrogen rates. It's only different for the 0, which we would expect. But even in the 0, we still got 172 hundredweight of gross with no nitrogen, which was impressive. And the trend you'll see on all of these fields, we generally, at the GSP and the 75, we did not see much difference in yield between where we had cover and no cover. Because where we had cover and no cover, the crop already had enough nitrogen. So the nitrogen that was carried over by the cover didn't really add anything. But at 50 and at 0, that extra nitrogen that was carried over by the cover crop into the next year did make a difference in yield. So I don't have the side-by-side comparison in these graphs because I wanted to try and keep it somewhat simplistic, but the 0N cover had 36 more hundredweight than the 0N no cover in this field. For Ranger russets, this was the only field where we actually saw basically the best yield was in the 100% rate, and it was the field that stayed green the longest. There was also some scab issues in the 50 and 0% rate here. And note, the 0 is in the same strip as the 50, so there is potentially some side effect there. I don't know if it's tied directly to the nitrogen had lower scab, but there was definitely more scab in that part of the field than in the rest of the field. But In this trial, we saw a little bit better yield with the 100% rate than the others. Again, 277 gross with no nitrogen applied. That tells you that, you know, the legume supplied a lot of nitrogen in this field. These are Mountain Gems, and again, this was a strong field going in, and this field looked gangbusters all year, and then didn't rain for 2 months. And I dug samples for the AIM tours in the last week of August, and then I dug this field the last week of September for the trial, and there was about 20 hundredweight between, you know, the yield improved 20 hundredweight in a month. So it just, you know, they stayed green, but they just couldn't bulk because they didn't have the moisture. But again, there's no difference statistically or numerically between 50, 75, and 100. Now, I'll note the GSP in this field, because of, again, we're working in grower fields, we're working with growers, I don't want to screw things up to them too much. His regular planter blend was 90N, and it was going to be a whole lot of rigmarole to get it to 80. So we left it at 90, and so the GSP in this one's actually 180 instead of 160. The 75 is 135 instead of 120, and the 50% nitrogen is 90 instead of 80. But we still see a very much a similar trend. We see, you know, actually numerically the best yield in the 50% nitrogen, but they're all statistically the same. And we see 267 gross yield with no nitrogen added, which is again pretty high, but higher than I would have thought. And we saw between the 0N cover and no cover, again, we saw like 6,700 hundredweight on the total yield and 50 hundredweight on the marketable difference. That cover crop carried over enough nitrogen to give us another 50 hundredweight. That's pretty impressive. And then our final one, this is the best yielding of the trial, so this is Fayette Russets. It was planted last, harvested last. In this one, again, there's no difference statistically between the three top nitrogen rates. Numerically, the best yield is with the 50%. In this one, we did see the cover crop was better than the no cover for both the 50 and the 0N. And again, it's a 110 hundredweight difference between cover crop and no cover crop in terms of yield in that no cover plot, or that 0N plot. So that cover crop can carry over a fairly significant amount of nitrogen to the next year. And again, this one's back to this 160, 120, 80. So as the other ones. So when I put them all together, because they're all pretty comparable, all same treatments, put all four together. Basically, there's no difference in yield, there's no difference in quality, there's no difference in defects, there's no difference in payout statistically between those top three treatments. There is for the 0, which we would expect. In no world do I ever say you can grow a crop potatoes without putting nitrogen on it. Like, that's not what we're here to talk about. But the reason the 0 is there to say, with no nitrogen, this is how much nitrogen can be delivered to the crop, so that we can use that information to inform what our nitrogen rate should be. And so far, now again, this is a dry year, so the crop only had the ability to uptake so much nitrogen, but having more nitrogen there did not make the crop better. The crop only had the ability to uptake so much nitrogen. So, for this year, on those 4 fields, the crop was not disadvantaged by having half as much applied nitrogen. Now, we're doing this project for 3 years, so we have 3 more years. So we got 4 more potato fields set up for this year. So we'll see what we see, and hopefully we'll get a little less dry year this year, that we'll be able to tease these differences out a little bit in a different year. I was pleasantly surprised at how much total yield and marketable yield we saw in those 0N plots. I knew that there would be, I didn't think they'd be less than 100, but I did not think we'd get some that were up to like 270, 280 gross, 240, 230 payable. Like, I just didn't think we'd see that. So.
Hey Ryan.
Yep.
Did you run any tissues on them all?
No.
No. Okay.
So again, would we see a difference in a moisture year? Quite possibly. Hopefully we'll see that difference this year or the next. But having higher nitrogen applied did not make a difference under drought stress. And like often we talk about, well, we need the nitrogen to get through the drought. We don't. The nitrogen doesn't do anything to the plant if it can't get into the plant, and it needs water to get into the plant. So that didn't really do us any good. I said we have 4 more fields set up this year. I have 1 in the east, 1 in the west, and 2 in the central. 2 of them are red clover this year instead of alfalfa, because we want to have red clover in there as well. 2 of them are alfalfa. 1 of them is late fall terminated. The other 3 are early fall terminated. So we should get a little diversity there. And Kyra and I are also looking at possibly adding a couple of corn fields to this as well, because corn has a similar nitrogen uptake curve to potatoes, in both in terms of quantity and timing. So, and there's more corn being grown, so we're interested in maybe trying to take on a couple of corn fields as well. Any questions on the nitrogen side on what we showed there? This is a work in progress. This is not take it to the bank data. This is just letting you know what we're working on. We got a couple more years to pull this data together. And I don't have the full data set either. I don't have all the soil test data yet, but just showing you that so far, if you've got a big crop of alfalfa, you can probably bank on a fairly strong nitrogen credit. That seems to be the story so far. And that's similar to what we've seen in past research. I did another trial 3 or 4 years ago up west, looking at alfalfa versus red clover and white clover and grass, and the alfalfa had the highest nitrogen mineralization and had the highest yield. It was definitely a bigger nitrogen credit from the alfalfa. So.
Does it mineralize faster with the alfalfa, right?
No, it mineralizes slower. Yeah. So that's why with the alfalfa, I would be very much recommending terminating it late summer, early fall, so that it will fully mineralize by the next year. Any other questions?
Was there any visual differences, Ryan, between the 75-50% in?
The only field where I saw somewhat of a visual difference, between the 50 and the 75, in the western field that was really dry, I could see a little bit of a difference. But in all the fields between the 75 and the 100, I could not see no visual difference, and I couldn't see anything on NDVI at all. And even that field of Rangers, I couldn't see the 0 end plot, except for I had it flagged, but if not for the flags, I couldn't see a foliar difference until August. So it wasn't really until August that you could say, okay, that one's starting to yellow a little more.
Yeah, that's what I guess I mean. Like as the summer went on, was it easier to pick out?
The 0 end plot, yes.
Yeah.
The 50 really only could pick it out in that one field.
Okay.
Yeah, it didn't really suffer in the others. Yeah, Chad?
Termination and then tillage. Like we're toying with the concept of termination in the spring in order to not have to plow. Because ultimately the plow would seal it in. Like were any of these vertical tilled?
They're all vertical till. So they're all Roundup in mid-August, 3rd week of August. Roundup does its job. Vertical till, and then 2 of the fields had the cedar box on the, like APV cedar on the Lemkin or whatever, so you're doing it one pass. Another one, the other 2, they're just broadcast barley ahead of the tillage, and then it worked it in, and then it grew up. So, but yeah, they're timing their tillage to be, you know, it's just vertical till, not World War plow, and it's late summer, early fall, and then there's lots of time for a good cover to come. And you've got a full year of that alfalfa. You know, they probably mowed it 2-3 times, and it grew up and was pretty vigorous and made a lot of nodules and all that sort of thing. If you kill that alfalfa too early, you're going to interrupt its ability to actually make a lot of nitrogen. Eric?
Yeah, great topic actually, Ryan. Peter and I have had some interesting discussions on the amount of nitrogen from the previous legume crops. And I think I made a statement at one of the previous potato meetings that didn't go over well, but we're far underestimating the amount of nitrogen from some really strong legume-based crops. Bert Christie was one of my profs at Guelph, and he moved here, worked with Ag Canada. And Bert made a comment to me just over a year ago that Ag Canada on the island did some long-term studies with grass swards and legume swards and mixed swards, and then into potato rotations, and had documented this really well. But how do we find that information? Like
some of it is published, some of it is in old dusty books and probably needs to get roasted around. but a lot of it was on red clover. And
Yes.
we don't have as much local data on alfalfa, which is why in the first year we started a lot of this with alfalfa. And in my cover crop survey that many of you responded to, thank you very much, we now have more alfalfa in rotation with potatoes than we do red clover by a fairly significant amount. There's still a lot of red clover, but alfalfa is more. So we need to have better information if people are integrating alfalfa into rotation of what these numbers are. And it, like, as I say, Omafra and a couple of these other ones, the alfalfa numbers like double the clover numbers. So we need to understand in a PEI context, is that accurate? And what sort of range are people comfortable with for those credits? Because there's a lot of people, you know, for good reason that, you know, haven't put much credit on, or if you do put a credit on, it's pretty low. And if you're spring tilling, or if you're like, you know, plowing in December, then yeah, probably that credit is going to be less. But if there's a lot of people that move towards early fall tillage, and if you're doing that on these type of legumes, you have to be prepared for a bigger nitrogen credit. And there's a benefit to that in terms of lowering your fertility, but you just have to know that in terms of doing your nutrient management, right?
But having said that, big crops demand a huge amount of nitrogen.
Yep.
Our issue in the industry, whether it's growing corn, potatoes, whatever, is, if I can use the word supplemental and in that sense, it can come from manure, it can come from, you know, a commercial product. But we as producers in an industry really have to watch putting nitrogen into the system that's not being used by our crop to make bigger yields.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is all about making sure that like growers are being cost effective with their use of nitrogen. They're getting enough nitrogen to grow the type of strong crops. I'm not advocating lowering nitrogen for the sake of lowering nitrogen. I'm advocating lowering nitrogen if it's nitrogen you don't need, and then it's just going to be orphan nitrogen at the end of the year, because that's nitrogen that then is going to get lost to the environment, either leached in the groundwater or off-gassed as nitrous oxide. So to me, it's about avoiding the waste, not saying use less nitrogen, use less nitrogen. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, you know, use the nitrogen you need. That's what I'm talking about. So transition to phosphorus. Again, phosphorus, very important macronutrient, key component in DNA and RNA, key component in ATP and ADP, which is part of the molecules in the energy transfer system in photosynthesis. The P in ATP and ADP is phosphorus, so that's very important. It's very important early in the season for stimulating root development and increased stalk and stem strength. This is a photo I took a couple of years ago. We had a cold snap in the spring, and I think these were prospects, and they're just coming out of the ground, and it was low pH field, cold, early planted. They're pretty purple, you know, and sometimes you'll see that, like that's a good strong sign of phosphorus deficiency. They'll grow out of this, but it probably stunted them a bit and held them back a bit, okay? How much phosphorus does the plant need? If you were budgeting for a 400 hundredweight gross crop, like 400 weight total yield, the tubers will take 60 pounds an acre out of the field, and you'll leave 20 in the field with the above ground biomass with the stalks. So you need 80 pounds an acre of phosphorus to grow a 400 hundredweight crop. We are, as an industry, putting on easily double that in most of our fields, and some 2.5 times that. There are really good reasons why our nitrogen or phosphorus rates have been high, and the chief amongst them is the fact that A, too much phosphorus doesn't really impact the crop negatively, unlike nitrogen. You put too much nitrogen on, we know that there's challenges in potatoes. You put too much phosphorus on, doesn't really set the crop back, doesn't really have an agronomic impact negatively on the crop. So has a negative impact environmentally, which we're going to talk about, but not really on the crop. Number two, historically we kept a lot of our fields at what, 5.5, 5.6 pH because we were really worried about scab, especially when we had fewer scab resistant varieties. Makes sense, 100% makes sense. At 5.5, that is the peak of fixation by aluminum. So aluminum is at its peak fixation of phosphorus at 5.5 pH. So you could have 400 or 500 ppm in the soil, but a whole pile of it is going to be tied up by aluminum. So that's why people were putting on more phosphorus, trying to make sure they got it into the crop. But all you have to do is get up to 5.8, 5.9, 6, and now at 6, it's like 75% more available than it was at 5.5. And a lot of fields that I test for my trials, and I'm working with growers, are 5.9, 6, 6.1, because you're trying to get alfalfa to grow. You're trying to get other crops to grow better. You're trying to grow a good crop or winter wheat. So a lot of people have moved those pHs higher. We have varieties that are more resistant to scab, especially in processing. So we have to look at our phosphorus rates and adapt with that as well. So if our pH goes to 6, we have 75% more phosphorus in our fields to play with. And I am seeing fields that are up to 500 plus ppmp in the soil test. That's on the PEI soil test, which is Melic 3. If you want to convert that, if you're using A&L, and they use Bray usually, I think, and that's probably more like 250, 300, something like that. Like, they're not directly comparable, but you know, Melic 3 is usually about double the A&L number, but still, like 500 ppm P2O5 in a 6-inch soil sample is 1,000 pounds an acre of phosphorus. And we only take 80 pounds out with a 400 hundredweight crop. So we are building a lot of phosphorus over the years. And again, agronomically that doesn't impact too much. If we were in Quebec, or if we were in Belgium, or if we were in a lot of other places that grow potatoes, there'd be legislations that say you can't put 1 pound of phosphorus on your field because you've already got all this phosphorus. When we went to Belgium and the Netherlands, like 90% of their fields, they do not put any phosphorus on because they either get it from the manure or they're legislated, like if your soil test is above this, you cannot put phosphorus on. If you're in Quebec and you have a dairy farm and you milk 100 cows and you don't have enough land base for all of your manure, you either have to have less cows or you have to have an agreement for someone to take some of your manure, because they have phosphorus quotas, because phosphorus that leaches to not groundwater, but runs off to surface water, like ponds and lakes and rivers and stuff, causes atrophic events and all these sorts of issues in Lake Erie and lots of different things. So we've been fortunate in PEI that this has not become an issue for us generally, but it can be a big issue, Chad.
When we have low, medium, high, and very high amounts of fixation,
Yeah.
is that like, if you throw a percentage or a parts per million at that, what does that mean? Like, what does medium mean?
Very high would be like 100% fixed. Like 100% of your soil phosphorus is unavailable. Very high is probably 75, 80%. Like, I don't have numbers on that scale.
Yeah.
This is a chart that I borrowed from a paper, but you know, at more acidic soils is more fixation, but there's these curves, right? So they're fixed by different ions. So fixed by iron, then it lets off. Fixed by aluminum, then it lets off. If we were in calcareous soils, we were in alkaline soils, it gets fixed by calcium. But that's not an issue here at PEI. So, there's also been lots of good local research done on this. So Judith with Ag Canada has done a pile of work on this. They did 23 sites in PEI over multiple years, both plot scale and grower fields. They really honed in on that pedo-aluminum saturation index to try and be a guide for growers as to how much phosphorus they should be using. In their work, if the pedo-aluminum was 10 or higher, the optimum P rate was 0. That meant that at 0 P, they got exactly the same yield or better than if they had applied P. When the pedo-aluminum rate was lower, it was between 5 and 10, then the optimum rate was 160, which is more what that's more of a similar rate to what people are using. Makes sense because there's probably more P tie up. Those 5 to 10 fields are probably more acidic. There's probably high aluminum, or maybe they're low P. So they use this information to update the rates or update the recommendations at the analytical lab. That's already built into the recommendations that come from the lab. This is from the PEI's Ag Quality Monitoring Program, and you can see everything that's green is less than 10 on that saturation index. What do most of those places that are green have in common? They're mostly places we don't grow potatoes. Everywhere else that grows potatoes is pretty much exclusively purple and blue and a bit of red, a bit of yellow. So again, this is field by field, so you should look at your individual field soil tests. All I'm saying is that in general, our potato growing areas have enough phosphorus that we can back up our phosphorus. So, again, this is a trial Kyra did. She gave me this data. This was a few years ago. There was no statistical difference in yield, particularly at the higher rates on yield, with reducing the phosphorus from over 200 pounds an acre down to 80. There's actually numerically better yield. It was statistically not different, but you know, there's no difference. There might be slightly less yield at that 40 rate, but again, there's no statistical difference there. This was a trial that a grower did without my involvement, just said, hey, I just did this field trial on myself, here you go, here's the data. They cut their grower standard practice was almost 200, they cut it in half. It's to the hundredweight. There's no difference. This was a field that was over 480 ppm, 14.4 on the saturation index, 6% organic matter, or 6% pH field, so a field that had lots of potential for cutting phosphorus. So, this year, I worked with 2 growers. One grower gave me 2 fields, another grower gave me 1. They were all fields that were high, like 5.9 to 6.1 pH, all fields with over 400 ppm P, all fields with an index over 10. And what we did is we took the grower standard practice, which was 160 or 150 pounds in the blend, and we backed it off to 100. The rest of the nutrients are the same. They're side-by-side trials. I took the samples side-by-side to the rows, tried to keep the background variability as minimal as possible. No differences in the foliage during the season, either by visual or by NDVI. These are the results for the first farm. The only statistical significance was on 10 ounce, and it was opposite on the 2 fields. One was higher with the GSP and one was lower with the GSP. Everything else was the same, statistically. That's the third field from the second farm. Again, everything is statistically the same. There's no difference statistically. Like, there's some small numerical differences, but that's only 6 strips per treatment in the field. So, you know, it's enough to give statistical significance, but it's, you know, I can't be sure that it's 900 weight higher. It's not statistically significant. I put all the fields together to give even more statistical power. There's no difference on any of this. It's all, like this says it's plus 129 payout. It's no difference. So 3 more fields added to the other fields we did. When there is a potential to reduce phosphorus because there is lots of phosphorus there and it's not being bound, we have not seen a reduction in yield by reducing phosphorus. What does that mean economically for you? A reduction of 50 pounds an acre of P2O5. If you just, like I took the cost of DAP and then I backed out the nitrogen that's in DAP and then you have to add that back in. So just the P2O5 part, on last year's fertilizer price is about $37 an acre. From what I've been told, the price of DAP's going up this year. So probably more like 40 or more. That is a savings of $18,650 on a 500 acre potato farm and no impact to your bottom line other than that, like no impact to your crop. So I think based on what Ag Canada's done, what Kyra's done, what we've done through AIM, what growers have done on their own farms, I've yet to see a trial that shows me that higher phosphorus has better yields on fields that already have lots of phosphorus. That being said, pay attention to your pH and P aluminum ratio. So I know there's some folks up here have some potatoes on new ground that hasn't had potatoes before or cleared ground. That's going to be low phosphorus and low pH, so you're going to need more phosphorus. You know, that makes sense. If you're taking over a field that's maybe been farmed hard and it hasn't had lime in 20 years or 10 years or something like that and the pHs are low, you're probably going to need more phosphorus. But for your fields that are higher pH and high phosphorus, you probably have opportunity to decrease it a bit. If you're doing a liquid in-furrow starter, how many people are doing liquid P? Nobody? Okay. If you were doing liquid P or you're looking at doing liquid P on the planters, back that off a little bit in your blend as well. You know, like that's an opportunity for savings as well. Like there's value in some of those liquid pea products. They can make it available in the root zone early in the season when the crop needs it, and it's less likely to be bound, especially if you're in a little bit more acidic soil. But also factor that into, you don't need to, you can, if you're getting 25 or 30 pounds an acre of pea out of your liquid, you can back it a little bit out of your blend a little bit, okay? Broadcast pea is generally a waste of money, especially if you're on again, if you have this buildup. Like if you're growing barley, you're growing wheat, and you got 400 ppm phosphorus in your field, and then you're broadcasting pea, you're just adding it to the bank, but it's not really going to be that much more available to the crop. So banding with pea is important if you need it. And if you're skeptical or you want to try it on some fields, by all means, if you want to talk to me about it, you want me to look at some soil tests or whatever, I'm happy to do so. There's opportunities to like look at your fields, look at your soil tests, and find a couple candidate fields. You think these are the fields with the highest P and the best pH. I'm going to try cut my rate on these and do some side-by-sides and see what you see. I'm always an advocate of start small and build up, right? Same as Kate did with her cover crops. Start on a couple poor fields and then scale it up, right? Any other questions about phosphorus before I move on? Yep.
Any opinion on foliar phosphorus?
Foliar phosphorus does not move into the leaf tissue as well as it does through the roots.
Okay.
And the majority of your phosphorus needs is in the earliest in the season when there's less of a foliage to take it up. So most of, like 75–80% of your phosphorus needs are in the first 2 months after planting.
Enough said.
Now, if you get into, you've got fields that are deficient and your soil test, your foliar test is coming up, your PDOs are coming up massively deficient and you need to figure something out, then work with your agronomist to talk about what makes sense. But generally, most of our fields, if the pH is higher and there's lots of phosphorus there shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. The next ones I'm going to run through a little faster just because I don't have the full data set to share with you yet. It's more just to keep you in the loop as to what we're doing. There's some of these they're long-term projects and there's more of a story to tell later on. We're just getting rolling on them. I started some work 2 or 3 years ago now on rotational grazing in potato rotations. Basically, we got lots of fields that are just getting mowed every summer, lots of clover and alfalfa and multi-species mixes just getting mowed or mowed and baled. We also have an industry, a government, and a beef industry that wants to expand, and they're looking for land, and they're looking for feed, and they're looking for cheap feed. And we have people looking for ways to add manure to their fields, but they don't want the biosecurity issues with taking manure from somebody's farm where they don't know what the cows were fed and all that sort of stuff and bringing that onto the farm. So, what if we could just put cows out on your field and have them mow your crop down, and then save you mowing the crop, and then they're putting the manure right back on the field. Instead of if you mow green matter, you grow clover and you mow it, and it goes onto the surface of the soil, it breaks down incredibly fast. And most of the carbon in that goes right up into the atmosphere, and a very small amount of it goes into the soil. But if you feed it to a cow, and it breaks it down in a rumen through enteric digestion, and then the carbon that comes down is already more stable and is more likely to stay on the surface and then will be integrated the next time you till or by earthworms or any of that sort of stuff, and it's more likely to return to the soil. That's the theory, right? So we wanted to see what effect grazing ahead of potatoes versus just mowing and mulching or baling would have on soil health, soil organic matter, and yield and quality. So we started the first field here, the Bluefield Acres Kingston View Farms field. We started that 2 years ago, so it was 2 years of grazing before potatoes. The other 2 were just 1 year of grazing before potatoes. This is the one with Craig McCluskey and Nick Green, and there'll be more. There's a panel on this at the soil and crop meeting, so if you want to talk about that a little bit more too, we'll dig into it a little bit more with the actual farmers. This trial, the field was set up in 3 strips. So one side was Sudan grass underseeded with alfalfa and timothy, and then the alfalfa timothy grew up the next year. That was all grazed. Then the middle was corn, which was a forage variety of corn, and the corn was grazed. And then the next year was just like a multi-species mix. That was all grazed. The corn was grazed in November. It was grazed after the hurricane, after Fiona, and the cows ate every bit of that. I went into that field afterwards, and it was like you could barely tell that there was corn there. So they ate every bit of it. And then they grazed all that, and then the control was just the normal rotation in that field, which was barley, underseeded, double cut red clover. Barley was harvested, straw was baled, and the clover was mulched. We sampled before the grazing, and then sampled each spring as well. And what I can tell you is so far, the results were maybe a little bit different than I was expecting. The organic matter climbed in all 3 treatments, but it grew the fastest in the control, which I thought was surprising. That being said, the control started at 2.7 and went to 3.3, and the other parts of the field started at 3 and went to 3.4. So it went a little faster in the control, but maybe I underestimated the sampling in the control in the first place. I'm not sure. The aggregate stability increased the most in the control and the corn and forage mix, which again, I did not expect because the Sudan grass alfalfa, deeper rooted stuff, I thought maybe it would be a little better. And actually the corn forage mix, that had the most amount of tillage. So I expected the aggregate stability to be lower, but it did increase. There wasn't much difference in the other soil health metrics. pH was very variable at the start. It got to be basically the same in all 3 treatments by the end. The nitrates after harvest were much higher in the control than in the other 2. I think part of that is, again, that amount of clover biomass that was plowed late and then mineralized late after the crop needed it. And I think probably that's why those residual nitrates were a little higher. For yield, it was very comparable for the control and the corn forage treatment. The Sudan grass alfalfa was lower. Borderline statistically lower. Again, that surprised me. Why did it surprise me? Because I went into this field a week before it was killed. This side of the field by the fence line was where the Sudan grass alfalfa was, and it was noticeably greener and noticeably healthier than this side, which was where the corn forage mix was. Like there's actually a little bit of verticillium and a little bit of yellowing on this side, and this side was still rank green. And I thought, oh man, this side's going to be better. And then I thought of it a little bit more, and I was like, oh right, it had more nitrogen, and it was delayed maturity, and it stayed greener longer, and it didn't bottom down as much as the rest of the field did. And this field was killed early. It was killed the first week of September because it was a seed field. So if the farmer had left this out till October, probably this side would have caught up and might have even done better. But because it was killed earlier, it was killed when it was still rank green, it didn't have that opportunity to catch up as much.
What variety did you say this was?
Alverstone Russets. Still had, 350 gross on Alverstone Russets for seed killed the first week of September is pretty good. But we would have thought that maybe it would have been a little more even across. And that's what it looked on the NDVI map. So you can see the Sudan grass alfalfa is all solid green, whereas the other 2 are a little more mottled through the topography. This dark green right here, that's a wet spot. So it looks better because more moisture accumulated there and the crop did better in the dry year. Rainers up west, they have the cows and the potatoes, so it was easy to manage because they were just managing everything within the house. They had a ryegrass field that they took the first cut off of, and then most of the field they grazed, and a part of the field they didn't graze. That's where the no graze treatment was there on the top side there, and the rest of it they grazed. That little brown spot's a manure pile. This was in a creamer variety that was grown for seed. Ag Canada worked with us to do the soil testing and the GHG emission data. I don't have that yet, but we'll be working on that. And then the field was also split between manure and no manure. Say the top The westernmost third of the field, or quarter of the field probably was no manure, and the rest of the field had manure. And we had an equal number of samples between manure and no manure. What I can tell you is that where they put the manure on the year before, the fall before, they had 34 more hundredweight than where they had no manure. That's pretty in line with a lot of the other trials we've done on manure work in the past. There was numerically more yield on the graze treatment than the control, but it was not significantly different. Yields were compromised by extreme drought. This field, like our yields were like 200, 210 because it's creamers, it's seed. They were killed at the end of August, and it didn't rain there for 2 months. So, and it's a sandy field too. But I can tell you, there was very noticeably fewer weeds in the grazed part of the field than there was in the non-grazed. So whether the cows chewed off more of those weeds the year before and lowered the seed, seed set on the weeds, I'm not sure, but we saw fewer weeds in the grazed part. And then Oyster Cove, Ramsey's with Ian Lockerbie. Again, we did pre-sampling prior to grazing. Did a fairly large field that we background sampled, but then only a part of it was in potatoes in 2024, but that part did have a control in it that was non-grazed. It was mostly a grass mix, not too much in the way of legumes. It was grazed 4 times in the grazing part. The control was mowed twice, and then it was spring plowed last spring, and that did cause some issues with lots of clumps and lots of sod that didn't break down and that sort of thing. So it wasn't ideal. It just ended up, how things kind of went. They ended up keeping the cows out on that field later than expected. And again, Ag Canada worked with us on the soil testing and the GHG emissions. I don't have a lot of that information yet, but will down the road. Again, we didn't see any significant difference in yield. There was more scab in the check than in the grazed. That could just be random, I'm not sure. It was not quite statistically significant. It was noticeable, but it wasn't quite statistically significant. Again, we had lower yields than expected because it was very, very drought stricken. It was just down the road from that legume trial that I had that I talked about with the Mountain Gems. And then this field's going to be grazed a bit more in the next 2 or 3 years, and we'll have a few more comparisons going on. So don't have nothing to hang your hat on yet, and I don't have a lot of the soil health data yet on the last 2 fields, so there's more story to tell on that. And then a couple of those fields, the plan is that they're now going to get grazed for a full rotation again, so they're going to get grazed for 2 more years and then back into potatoes in 2027. There are 2 more fields that have been grazed previously that are going to be in potatoes this year. And I have another field that's started being grazed this year. It's going to be grazed. It was grazed last year. It's going to be grazed this year, and it's going to be potatoes in 26. So over the length of this Living Labs project, we should have 7 or 8 field day years worth of data to share. Any questions? I know I'm bombing through some of this a little fast, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavor as to what we're working on. No eureka moments on this data yet, but hopefully we'll know a little bit more as we add more farms and add more data.
How did the animals do, Ryan? Were the beef producers happy?
Beef producers are very happy. Nick tells me that his gain per day on that field at Craig's was as good as some people get in their feedlots. So he was very happy. And he moved them they would graze like an acre, acre and a half, and then move them, graze an acre and a half, move them. So they weren't just mob grazed out into a field, they were being moved. So they're utilizing all of that and then allowing it to then recharge and regrow.
How did he water them?
It was a little different each farm. One farm had a central watering station and the cows had to go back and forth to the watering station. Another farm had multiple watering stations kind of up the field, that sort of thing. But they each had 2 of them had a well not too far away, so they didn't have to move water too far. And then one of them, they did have to pipe water from across the road, but they had a filling station and tanks. And then at Matt's, he just filled the water truck for the sprayer, and once every couple of days would go and recharge the tank from the water truck. Something to think about as we get further into this research. Quite a few of you on the survey said that this is something that you're kind of interested in. And you're interested in learning more, so that's why we're doing the trial.
You're right, there's still money available this year for fencing for neighbors who want to do that.
Yep. Off-calf is supposed to be resetting again this year with a new program, so there should be money available for that. And the province has Daryl hired as a grazing mentor and stuff for people to help them do those kind of plans and that sort of stuff. So there's provincial government support as well as support through the Federation and the off-calf program for grazing programs.
Well, your 50-acre field though, like how long would it take for the, like how long you keep them in the little acre? Like a day or?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah. Depends on your stocking rate, right? So it depends on how many cows they're trying to put through.
So it's not something like you're gonna do a couple hundred acres on, it's, you're picking.
Yeah, you pick a couple of fields and they probably move around between that. Depends again, and depends on doing cow. Is it cow calf or is it feeder steers or like depends on how much they're eating, that sort of thing. How often you're moving them. Any other questions? Long-term cover cropping, I don't have as much to share on this yet because we're just kind of getting going, and the first couple of years of this trial have had some hiccups. We did a lot of work in the last Living Labs on cover crops, both before potatoes and after potatoes. We got a lot of good data from that. We saw some real differences, some real statistical differences in terms of increased yield following covers ahead of potatoes. We saw reduced potential for erosion. We saw increased nitrate uptake. We saw all good things from that. But one thing that was hard to tease out of that data was soil health and organic matter. What impact are the cover crops having? And it's really hard to tell that in 1 year or like 2-year intervals, right? That takes time, it takes rotations to see. So in this Living Labs, we said, well, what if we could follow the same field for like 5 years and look and see how maybe organic matter and soil health change over having a cover crop every year versus having no cover crop every year. So that's what we did. We set up 2 fields with this. In 2023 that were in potatoes in 2024, and then we started a 3rd field this fall with Chad, with Moons, that was covered after potatoes, and then we're going to follow it for the next 4 years. I don't have all the soil test data back, especially all the soil health data back, because Ag Canada has been helping me with it, and I haven't gotten all the reporting from them yet. Also worked with So Young with UPEI. She layered onto this project as part of her master's, and doing the GHG work on it for the most part. And she'll have more on that to share this winter as well. One of the fields had a very poor cover crop establishment in 2023 because, how do you guys remember, it was wet in August and September in 23, and this field was harvested early with, it was perennial, or it was ryegrass for seed. It was combined, and then the straw was left, and then they couldn't get the straw picked up, and then the straw just went all to black mulch, and then they couldn't get it off the field, and then they couldn't get the field worked properly. They couldn't get the Roundup to do a good job, and they just had a lot of problems. So we didn't get the cover crop on this field till October, when we intended on getting it on in August. So, it got a cover, and it was this big, but it wasn't great. The other field, it was tillage radish, and it was done in early September, and it looked fine. And we had a cover versus no cover section. And actually, that field is one that we have with Cavendish and Island Holdings. It's that Discovery Farm in New London that you're going to hear more about. You might have heard at the Cavendish banquet, so we're doing some work with them on that one. We didn't see any differences in yield or quality between the cover and the no cover in the potato crop. We got better covers on this year, so we got better coverage this year in the cover crop, and we got better data to accompany that, so hopefully we'll see a little bit more difference. These are going into cereals this year, then they're going to go into a cover crop, and then they're going to go back into potatoes in 27, so we're going to cover them over that whole time. The new field, Mooney's, this was something a little different. Chad wanted to try his new drone for putting cover crop on. So it was put on pre-harvest with the drone. I would say in places it did really well. In places it didn't do so well. And I'm not sure, I don't really actually think it was the fault of the drone. I think it was just that there was places where there was a lot of truck traffic and it just didn't establish really well and that sort of stuff. So it might be just another time we might look at drilling it in afterwards, do a light till and drilling it in. But it was our first time using the drone. It was cool to try that for a trial, and we'll probably, I know Chad's interested to do some more work on it, so we'll probably do a little bit more on that going forward.
I would say a touch of operator error.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to throw you under the bus.
Cool plus.
We have, so this field's just starting, so we've got a lot of baseline data this year, and then we'll be, again, we're following into rotation for 4 more years. So. Kind of alongside that, I also have a project as part of the national cluster with the FPGC looking at regenerative agriculture practices. I have 2 slightly different trials as part of this project. One of them's at Fox Island. We're trying to up our game on agronomy at Fox Island, especially in terms of what we do with rotation. So we've taken the grain out of the rotation at Fox Island, and we've gone to a 2-year forage mix with alfalfa and grasses and a little bit of white clover. And then we've also tried to do more cover cropping. It's difficult for us because we don't have a vertical tillage, and we have an old crappy cedar box, and we're a little limited on our equipment, but we're trying to do the best we can. And so I'm working with Mark on this, Mark Fridham, and we've got part of the field that's going to be covered every year and part of the field that's not, and we're doing this sampling over time. We didn't see a difference in yield this year. This was in Burbanks. Again, Burbanks for seed. We didn't see much difference in yield. We did see some trends on most of the soil health metrics that were in favor of the cover crop. So we'll see whether we keep seeing that trend increasing over time. This is, for those who've been to Fox Island, it's sandy soil and it's lower pH because it's just a seed farm trying to keep the scab off. So we're, it's a little more of a challenging trial for me. What we found is the winter cereals way better at establishment than the spring cereals for after potatoes. So definitely, take home message from this so far was we did way better with the rye after potatoes than we did with the spring barley. Established faster, covered more, stayed green longer. It's going to stay green all winter. It'll regrow in the spring. The barley just dies. So definitely going to go with the winter cereals more. And then Shoreline Farms, this is over in Indian River, this field, and this one we're actually comparing some different rotation. So along the lines of what kind of stuff we talked about today, grower standard practice is potatoes, wheat, underseeded alfalfa, 2 cash crops in there. Comparing that with a cash crop every year, but with covers after the 2 cereal crops. So they have peas that went in after the wheat, and there'll be peas next year after the barley. And then direct seeded alfalfa this year, and throw it out for 2 years ahead of potatoes. And then, we're going to look at this in the, so this just started this year, so potatoes in 26. So that's under the cluster with FPGC. And then the last thing, these are some additional grower trials that I'm doing with growers. Just growers said, hey, I want to try something a little different, or I want to see if you can help me get some data on this, and I'm happy to oblige. So the first one, that's with Macaulay. So we're looking at barley underseeded clover versus 2 years alfalfa and Timothy direct seeded versus 2 years of annual crops. So Sudan grass the first year and radish the second. And so we had one field set up in 2023 that's going to be potatoes this year. Another was set up last year, it's going to be potatoes in 26. Field here with Will, that's wheat underseeded with a forage mix compared to just direct seeding that forage mix and maybe getting that forage mix established a little faster. We have a split field trial on that out in Morel. We've got a barley underseeded alfalfa compared to, again, that direct seeded alfalfa Timothy compared to corn, followed by barley the next year. So again, that 3 cash crop, 2 cash crop, 1 cash crop comparison. And looking at, with getting covers on there and all that sort of stuff, what's the difference? That one's in West Prince. And then I have another one in East Prince down by Borden. That's barley, again, barley underseeded alfalfa compared to corn and barley in rotation. These last 2 just started in 24, so they won't be potatoes till 26. If there are some people that would like to try some rotation trial stuff and they want me to follow it and they want some help with the soil sampling and the yield estimation and stuff, these are reasonably easy trials to do and reasonably easy trials to follow, and they don't take a lot of sampling costs and they don't take a lot of management time. So I can take on 2 or 3 more of these trials if it's something that you're interested in, and we can have a conversation on, and particularly if you want to compare sort of these different dynamics between cash crops and non-cash crops and different types of covers maybe, that sort of thing. Reduced tillage versus conventional tillage, that sort of stuff. Any of that sort of stuff, if you're interested in, I'm happy to have a chat with you, and we could probably take on a few more of those trials. All basically, Bethany and I gotta go and soil sample it in the spring, and you guys get it set up how you want, and we put a few flags in the ground, and we'll come out and soil sample it again the next year, and we'll, you know, it's not super complicated. Thank you to all the people that supply funding and partner with us on these projects. Of course, our AIM core funders is you guys, the growers, the province, and Cavendish. Living Labs, of course, we're working with Ag Canada, the East Prince Group, Dalhousie, and University PEI increasingly. FPGC I mentioned as well. That's how to get a hold of me. If you're a CCA, you can scan that for your CCA credits. Or you can send me your CCA number and I'll send it in for you, whatever's easiest for you. Any questions before we wrap? We're 10 minutes to 12, so. Any questions, comments, thoughts? You well-behaved group? You know how to get a hold of me if you want to talk or you want to chat about things a little further. I appreciate your warm welcome for Kate. I hope you were as interested and happy with the presentation as I've been. She had very strong, we had good turnouts here and good turnouts at the other two meetings and lots of good comments and questions, so hopefully it was well received. The next meetings, so Potato Conference is the 12th in Summerside. Full day meeting. The agenda's gone out by email to you. If you don't have it, it's also on the website. The next AIM workshops is here on February 26th. We're going to be talking scab with Rick Peters and Claudia Goye from Fredericton, and I'll have a few trials to talk about as well. And then March 20th, back here again, is Andy Robinson from North Dakota State University, and Andy's about as knowledgeable as anybody in North America when it comes to weeds and herbicides and potato rotations. So he's going to come talk about all things weeds. So pre-emerge and managing a rotation and glyphosate damage and glyphosate drift and any of that sort of stuff. Burn down, yeah. So hope that you'll be able to come for that as well. So that's it for me.